If you ever hear your name called in the wilderness, don't answer. Because sometimes the thing calling you isn't human. I know that sounds ridiculous. I wouldn't have believed it either. But I was there. I heard it. And I did answer. It was 4 days into my solo hike through Glacier National Park, deep along the Highline Trail. No roads, no cell signal, no people, just me, my pack, and endless miles of wilderness. The days were peaceful, long hikes, the sound of distant waterfalls, the occasional deer cutting through the underbrush. But the nights were different. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was pressing, like the entire forest was holding its breath. The fourth night, I made camp in a small clearing near a ridge, overlooking miles of untouched forest. I had my dinner, zipped up my tent, and fell asleep to the distant sound of crickets and wind through the trees. Then, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what. A noise? A dream? But then, clear as day, I heard my name. Soft, close, almost playful, like someone was standing just outside my tent, calling me. Hey, come out here. I shot up, heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight, hand shaking as I listened. No footsteps, no rustling, just the wind. And then, come out here, the same voice, the same tone, closer. My brain fought against itself. Maybe it was another hiker, a ranger, but I hadn't seen another person in days. I swallowed hard. My mouth was dry. My pulse thumped in my ears. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the zipper. I hesitated. Something in my gut told me not to open it. But I did. I unzipped the tent just an inch, just enough to peek outside. My flashlight cut through the darkness, scanning the treeline. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the stars overhead, the empty trail stretching into darkness. I shined the light downward, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, right outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I followed the trail with my light, heart pounding. And then it hit me. The prints only led toward my tent. There were no prints leading away. I was frozen, paralyzed. I knew what that meant. Something had walked up to my tent, but it never walked away. My skin turned ice cold. I yanked the zipper closed and sat there in complete silence, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting, but it never came back. By morning, I told myself it was exhaustion. Maybe I had imagined it. I packed up quickly and started moving before the sun even fully rose. By the time I reached the nearest ranger station, I felt foolish for even bringing it up. But I had to know. I told the ranger, just casually, "Hey, has anyone else ever heard voices at night out there?" He froze, his face drained of color. He put down his pen, staring at me. Then he asked very quietly, "You were near the Highline Trail, weren't you?" A lump formed in my throat. "Yeah." His fingers drummed against the desk. Then, without looking at me, he muttered, "A hiker went missing there a few years back. Never found the body. His friends, they said they heard him calling for help at night. Long after he was gone, I felt my body go cold. I should have left then. Should have just walked out of that station and never looked back. But I had one last question. Did anyone ever find footprints?" The ranger finally met my eyes. His expression was unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he just said, "You're not the first to ask that. If you ever hear your name called in the wilderness, don't answer." I walked through a tunnel in the woods, and when I came out, 5 years had passed. You hear stories about people going missing in the wilderness. People who vanish without a trace, whose footprints simply stop, as if they were plucked from the earth. But what if some of them never really left? What if they came back to a world that no longer recognized them? It was late October when I decided to go hiking near Clingman's Dome in the Smoky Mountains. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that creeps in at night but lingers in the shadows during the day. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just an excuse to escape the noise of life. A few days alone in the woods, No emails, no distractions, just me, the trees, and the endless, winding trails. I had been on the trail for about 2 hours when I spotted something odd. It was a path, but not one that should have been there. It was barely marked, overgrown with roots and moss, as if it hadn't been walked in years. I should have ignored it. I should have stuck to the map trails. But there was something about it, something that felt different. So I stepped off the main trail. I remember the way the trees seemed to close in around me. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, distant streams, just stopped. And then I saw it. Tunnel. Not a man-made tunnel. Not something carved into rock. This was something else. The trees, they had grown together. Their branches twisted and knotted into an archway, forming a perfect tunnel over the path. It looked almost intentional, as if someone or something had shaped it. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe it was the way the light didn't seem to touch the ground beneath it. Maybe it was the way the air felt thicker. But I stepped forward, 1 foot in, then the next. Took less than a minute to walk through, maybe even less than that. And when I stepped out the other side, everything had changed. The first thing I noticed was the sky. It was darker, not like a storm was coming, more like the light itself had dimmed. The air was heavy, pressing against my skin like a weight. I pulled out my phone to check the time. The screen was black, wouldn't turn on. My watch, frozen. The second hand was stuck, twitching slightly but never moving forward. I felt off, like I had walked into a version of the world that was just slightly wrong. But I told myself it was nothing. A weird trick of the light. A dead battery. My mind playing games. So I started walking back. The trail felt longer. The trees looked different. The deeper I went, the more unease set in. Like I was walking through a place that didn't quite belong to me anymore. Then finally I saw it. The parking lot. My car. Relief washed over me until I got closer. Something was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the windshield, covered in dust and leaves, like it had been sitting there for weeks. Then I saw the tires, flattened, cracked with dry rot. I reached out, running my fingers over the hood. The paint was faded. The metal was rusted. This wasn't possible. I had parked here this morning. I backed away, my heart hammering, my breath coming fast and sharp. I reached for my keys, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door. The hinges creaked loudly, like they hadn't moved in years. I sat inside, trying to steady myself. The air smelled stale. Dust coated the dashboard. The radio wouldn't turn on. The engine wouldn't start. I was panicking now. I needed to find someone. I grabbed my backpack, shoved open the door, and ran. It took over an hour, but I finally reached a small roadside gas station. I was breathless, covered in sweat despite the cool air. I walked inside, ready to ask for help. Then I saw the calendar on the wall. The date. My stomach twisted. My vision blurred at the edges. 5 years. 5 years had passed since the day I parked my car. Since the day I walked into that tunnel. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a rack of newspapers. My hands were shaking as I grabbed one, scanning the date at the top. It was real. I felt my knees go weak. I needed to leave. Now, I reached into my pocket, pulling out my wallet. My ID was there. My credit card. Everything was the same except the expiration dates. I had vanished for 5 years. The cashier was staring at me. I must have looked insane. Dirty, panicked, eyes wide with terror. "Are you okay?" he asked. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to ask for help. But what could I say? I walked through a tunnel and lost 5 years of my life? I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced out, "Do you have a phone I can use?" The cashier hesitated, then nodded, handing me the store phone. My fingers felt numb as I dialed my parents' number. It rang once, twice, then a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years answered. My mother's voice, aged, tired, disbelieving. "Hello." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Then her breath hitched, a strangled sound on the other end of the line. "Oh my God." Silence. Then, we thought you were dead. I thought it was just a reflection. Then I realized it was staring back. Lakes hold secrets. Beneath the glassy surface, there are things we are never meant to see. And sometimes, when we do, they see us too. It started as a solo trip. 5 days alone, paddling through Quetico Provincial Park, deep in the backcountry where cell service doesn't exist, and the only sound is the wind through the trees. I had done this before. This wasn't my first trip into the wilderness. I knew how to navigate, how to read the water, how to respect the land. But looking back, I should have paid more attention to the lake, to the way it felt off. The first few days were perfect. The kind of solitude you can only find this far from civilization. No trails, no people. Just endless pine forests and miles of untouched lakes. I camped by the water every night, letting the sound of small waves lapping against the shore lull me to sleep. But on the 4th day, something changed. I had paddled further than planned and ended up near a lake I couldn't find on my map. It wasn't supposed to be there. No markings, no trails leading to it. Just a stretch of dark, still water surrounded by thick trees. It looked untouched, unnamed, almost too perfect. I should have turned back. I should have listened to the feeling in my gut, the one that told me I wasn't supposed to be there. But instead, I beached my canoe, set up camp, and sat by the water, watching the sunset turn the lake's surface into a mirror. That's when I saw it. I had bent down to refill my water bottle when I caught my reflection. The lake was so perfectly still that my face stared back at me like a photograph. But then, it moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a fish breaking the surface. But the movement was slower, deliberate. My reflection shifted, just slightly, even though I hadn't moved. And then, beneath it, I saw something else. Eyes. Not one pair. Dozens. Wide, open, staring up from the depths. Some too big, some too small, but all locked onto me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The water was so clear I could see the shapes of them. Faces or something close to faces. Features stretched, distorted, too deep to be human, too defined to be anything else. I told myself I was imagining it, that my brain was misinterpreting rocks, shadows, fish schooling together in some strange pattern. But then, one of them blinked. I don't know how long I crouched there, staring into that lake. My legs had gone numb. My fingers clenched around my bottle so tight my knuckles ached. But I couldn't move, because I knew the second I did, something would happen. I didn't know what. I didn't want to find out. I forced myself to stand, forced myself to turn away. The moment I broke eye contact, the air felt heavier, like whatever was beneath that water was waiting. Listening, I went straight to my tent, zipped it up, and didn't come out again until dawn. By morning, I convinced myself I had been hallucinating. Sleep deprivation, exhaustion, the isolation playing tricks on my brain. But when I stepped out of my tent and looked toward the water, the lake was gone. Not drained, not evaporated. Gone. The land where the water had been was completely dry. Cracked earth, scattered rocks, patches of grass that looked like they had been growing there for years. No mud, no sign of receding water, just solid ground, as if the lake had never been there at all. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, my canoe still sitting exactly where I left it, but now on land. My footprints from the night before still led to the water's edge, but now they just ended. I didn't stay. I packed my gear, dragged my canoe back to the nearest marked lake, and paddled for hours, not stopping until I reached a ranger station. I didn't tell them everything, just that I had come across a body of water that didn't match the map. The ranger gave me a confused look, pulled out his own copy, and traced his finger over the section where I had camped. There was nothing there. Weeks later, I went back through my camera. I had taken dozens of photos during the trip, shots of my campsite, the trees, the sky. But when I reached the photos I had taken near that lake, my stomach dropped. They were wrong. The angles, the lighting, something wasn't right. In every shot, the lake was there, reflecting the sky. But in the last one, It wasn't just trees, the shoreline, dry land. The lake had disappeared from my photos before it disappeared from reality. I haven't been back to Quetico since. I won't go near that part of the park, because I know what I saw, and I know somewhere out there that lake still exists, waiting for the next person to find it, waiting for them to look down and see what's looking back. I met a ranger on the trail. The next day, I saw his face. On a missing person poster, people vanish in national parks all the time. Some are found, some are never seen again, and some come back even when they shouldn't. It was mid-September, just as the summer crowds had died down. The air was crisp, the leaves had started to turn, and I had planned a solo hike through Shenandoah National Park. Specifically, the Old Rag Mountain Loop. A challenging trail, but nothing I hadn't done before. I had started early, just after sunrise, hoping to make good time. The trail was quiet, mostly empty. I passed maybe 2 other hikers in the first few miles. After that, it was just me, the trees, and the steady crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I was about 3 hours in when I saw him, a park ranger, standing just off the trail near a clearing. His uniform was crisp, his radio clipped neatly to his vest. He was older, mid-50s maybe, short-cropped graying hair, kind eyes, the kind of face that seemed familiar, even though I was sure I'd never met him before. He smiled and gave me a nod. "Enjoying the hike?" he asked. I nodded back. "Yeah, it's beautiful out here." We talked for a bit. He asked where I was from, how often I hiked, the usual small talk. He warned me about black bears in the area and reminded me to stay on the marked trails. I remember how calm he was, professional but friendly. He gave off the exact kind of energy you'd expect from a veteran ranger, someone who had spent years in the wilderness and knew it better than anyone. After a few minutes, he gave me a polite nod, said, "Stay safe out there," and walked off down the trail. I kept hiking, thinking nothing of it. The next morning, I stopped at the visitor center before heading home. I was sore, a little tired, but feeling good. Just making small talk, I casually mentioned the ranger I met, saying how helpful he'd been. The woman behind the desk looked up, confused. "Which ranger?" she asked. I hesitated, suddenly realizing I hadn't caught his name. I described him instead, his uniform, his radio, his grayish hair. Her face changed. She glanced at her coworker, then back at me. Her expression was wrong, not just confused. Something else. She asked me to wait a second, then stepped into a back room. A minute later, she came back holding a laminated sheet of paper. A missing persons poster. She set it on the counter. I felt my stomach drop. It was him. Same face, same uniform, same eyes looking back at me, but in a photo that looked old, like it had been taken decades ago. I scanned the details, my heart pounding. His name was Ranger William Hensley, missing since 2013. 10 years ago, I felt lightheaded. My mouth went dry. I shook my head. "No," I said. "That's not possible. I just talked to him yesterday. I saw him on the trail." The woman's face tightened. She shook her head. "That's not possible," she said. "William Hensley went missing 10 years ago. His body was never found. I should have left. I should have walked out right then. But I couldn't move, because in that moment, something hit me. A detail I hadn't thought about before. He had called me by my name. Before I ever told him, I replayed the conversation in my head. Every detail, every word. I never introduced myself, never mentioned my name, but he had said it. Casually, like he already knew. A cold wave of nausea rolled over me. I looked back at the missing persons poster, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was someone who just looked like him. Maybe. But then the woman spoke again, softly, hesitantly, like she was debating whether or not to tell me something. "You're not the first person to say they've seen him." I stared at her. She looked uneasy, glancing at her coworker again before continuing. We've had reports over the years. Hikers saying they met a ranger who matched his description. Always alone, always deep on the trails. And every time they come back here and ask about him, they see this poster and realize the truth. She swallowed, lowered her voice. One guy even swore Ranger Hensley saved his life once. Found him after he got lost, walked him back to the trailhead. Only when he got home did he realize. She tapped the poster, her eyes dark. The man who helped him had been missing for years. I backed away from the counter. My hands were shaking. This wasn't possible. It wasn't real. Couldn't be real. But I knew what I had seen. I knew who I had spoken to. And somehow he had known me. I don't talk about this often. When I do, people laugh it off, say I must have misidentified someone, or imagine the whole thing. But I remember every second of that conversation. Every detail of his uniform, his face, the way he spoke like he had been doing that job for years. And there's one more thing. When I got home, I went through my gear, unpacking my backpack. I reached into the front pocket, feeling for my folded map, and my fingers brushed against something else. A small, folded piece of paper. Old, yellowed at the edges. I pulled it out, opened it, and felt the breath leave my lungs. It was a Shenandoah National Park Ranger report, dated October 2013. The same month Ranger Hensley went missing. The handwriting was clear, written in blue ink. The last words on the report sent a chill down my spine. Patrolling Old Rag Loop today. Weather fair. No issues. Encountered solo hiker. Name. It was my name. Three of us went into the woods. We all heard the sound. I was the only one who made it out. Some places are quiet in ways they shouldn't be. And some sounds were never meant to be heard by human ears. The Adirondacks are huge. Millions of acres of dense forest, rivers, mountains. Places where people can disappear without a trace. That's why we chose it. We wanted to go somewhere truly isolated. Somewhere no one else would be. There were three of us. Me, Jason, and Eric. We were experienced hikers, experienced campers. We weren't idiots. We knew how to prepare, how to read the weather, how to navigate even when the trails disappeared. We weren't worried when we set off, but we should have been. The first day was uneventful. We followed an old logging road into the woods, then went off-trail to find a good campsite. By sunset, we had set up our tents in a small clearing beside a lake. It was peaceful, quiet, too quiet. That night, as we sat around the fire, we heard it for the first time. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a hum, low, vibrating, deep enough to feel in our chests. It was everywhere, but nowhere at the same time. No direction. No source. Just there. Eric frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "You hear that?" he asked. Jason nodded, poking at the fire. "Yeah, weird. Probably just whined through the trees." But I wasn't so sure. I had never heard wind sound like that. It didn't stop. It just kept going. A constant, vibrating tone just beneath the range of normal hearing. Deep enough to make my stomach feel tight. After a while, we stopped talking about it. We went to bed. But none of us really slept. By the next evening, Jason was gone. His tent was still there. His gear, his boots, his backpack, everything exactly where he left it. But Jason, gone. No footprints leading away. No sign of struggle. No reason why he would have just walked off. Eric and I searched for hours, calling his name, hiking through the trees with our flashlights. Nothing. No trace. Just the endless trees and the sound of the wind. And then, the sound came back. That same deep, humming frequency. Louder this time. More intense. My teeth buzzed. My chest felt like it was being squeezed. Eric cursed, pressing his hands against his ears. "I hate that sound," he muttered. That night we didn't sleep. We sat awake by the fire, waiting for Jason to come back. But he never did. By the third night, it was just me. Eric was gone too. I had woken up to find his tent empty. his sleeping bag half unzipped like he had gotten up in the middle of the night and just left. But that didn't make sense. I had been awake most of the night. I would have heard something, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. And then the sound, louder than ever, it rattled my skull. It made my vision blur. I staggered out of my tent, heart pounding, eyes darting between the trees. Something was wrong. My ears burned. My hands were shaking. The sound wasn't just a noise anymore. It was inside me. And then, just before I blacked out, I heard something else. A voice. Jason's voice. It was distant, warped, like he was calling out from the bottom of a deep well. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it was him. And I knew, somehow, he wasn't anywhere I could reach. When I woke up, I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was in a hospital. Search and rescue had found me alone at our campsite. No sign of Jason. No sign of Eric. Just me, collapsed outside my tent, hands covering my ears. The doctor said I was suffering from extreme dehydration. But that didn't explain everything. Because when they examined me, they found something else. My ears were bleeding. I didn't remember that. I didn't remember anything after hearing Jason's voice. But the doctors said the blood was fresh. Whatever had happened to me, it had happened right before I was found. The official report said my friends were lost. Search teams scoured the area for weeks. No footprints, no bodies, no signs they had ever been there. The only thing they found was a single melted phone battery near Jason's tent. They said it had been exposed to extreme heat, but there had been no fire, no storms, nothing. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know what we heard, but I know one thing for certain. That sound wasn't natural. It wasn't meant for us to hear. Have you ever had that feeling that something is watching you? I saw it, but only in my camera lens. Some places are quieter than others, and sometimes that silence doesn't feel right. I had spent the last few days deep in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, a vast, remote stretch of northern Minnesota. It's the kind of place where you can get lost if you're not careful. A few days alone with nothing but the forest and the lakes. It was supposed to be peaceful. The first day was everything I expected. Calm, serene, untouched. I paddled across the lakes, fished, set up camp by the shore, and simply enjoyed being away from it all. There's something about the wilderness that makes you feel so small, so insignificant, and that's what I loved about it. By the second night, the quiet was starting to feel different. At first, I shrugged it off as the usual eerie silence that falls over you when you're out in nature alone. But it felt heavier somehow, like the air had thickened. Something about the trees seemed to loom larger, and every noise seemed to echo unnaturally long. I set up my camera to take some shots of the forest, my usual routine when I'm camping. I wanted to capture the stillness, the isolation. But as I reviewed the pictures, I noticed something strange. In every shot, no matter the angle, no matter where I stood, I saw eyes. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the lens, maybe a reflection off the water or something from the foliage. But each time I checked the photos, I saw the same thing. Two eyes, staring out from the edge of the trees. I checked the camera screen, zoom in, but when I looked up to the tree line, there was nothing. Not a person, not an animal. Just trees and shadows. It happened again the next day. Every time I set up my camera, I'd see the eyes in the distance, at the edge of the trees. The eyes were always there, always just watching, even when nothing was visible to the naked eye. The more I zoomed in on the camera, the clearer they became. The eyes weren't just there, they were following me. But when I'd look up, nothing. Just the woods. Just the silence. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a trick of my mind. Being alone for too long in the wilderness, my brain playing tricks on me. But when I moved locations, I noticed the same thing happening. I set up my tent by the edge of a small clearing near a lake. I was trying to take some night shots, trying to capture the stars over the water, and once again, I saw it. The eyes. They were back. And this time, they were closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. Yet, when I checked the photos, I saw them again. Two dark eyes staring back at me from the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the branches, every rustle in the leaves made my heart race. I felt it. The eyes were still there, even when I closed my eyes. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just fatigue. I was overthinking it. But the longer I stayed, the more unsettling it became. The next morning, I packed up my gear, ready to leave, but I decided to take one final shot before I left. The camera was aimed at the treeline once again, and I zoomed in for the last picture, hoping to capture one final image of the wilderness before heading back. And then I saw them. The eyes were no longer in the distance. They were directly behind me. I felt a chill run through me, so cold I could almost feel it physically. I didn't dare turn around. I stayed completely still, not breathing, waiting. When I finally gathered the courage to look, I saw nothing. No one. Just the trees and the vast, empty wilderness. But when I checked the camera screen, I saw the image. Clear as day, the eyes staring at me from behind, just at the edge of the frame. They were so close now, it felt like they were looking directly into me. I didn't wait around. I packed up my gear faster than I've ever moved in my life, and I left the area. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest trailhead and saw other hikers. I didn't say much. I just needed to be around people again, to hear voices, to feel like I wasn't being watched every second. When I returned home, I went through the photos again. I don't know why I did it, maybe to prove to myself that it was just my imagination. But when I opened the last image, the one from behind me, I noticed something else. The eyes weren't just watching me, they were smiling. I haven't been back to the Boundary Waters since. I don't know what I saw out there, but I know one thing for sure. Something was watching me, and whatever it was waiting. They found my camera, but I'm still missing. Sometimes the camera captures more than you intend. It shows what you didn't want to see. But what happens when the camera is the only thing left behind? It was supposed to be a simple trip, a solo backpacking journey through Olympic National Park in Washington State. A few days on the coast, then a trek through the dense, old-growth forests. I was filming a vlog to document the journey, to capture the beauty of the wilderness on video. I had done this before, hiked solo, filmed for YouTube, stayed in remote campsites. I wasn't worried. I knew the area, I knew how to navigate, and I had all the right gear. The first 2 days went smoothly. The views were incredible. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that feels like you're in the middle of something vast and untouched. Perfect conditions for filming. But the third night, things changed. It started at dusk, as I was finishing my dinner near my tent. I heard something strange. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No rustling. No birds, no insects. I thought maybe it was just the time of day, or the breeze shifting through the trees, but then I heard a twig snap, a step. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. I paused, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. But there was nothing, not even the wind. I pushed it out of my mind, but the feeling didn't go away. Something wasn't right. The quiet felt too heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. As night fell, I set up my camera to capture the night sky. I kept hearing that same sound, just outside the edge of the trees, the steady crunch of footsteps. But when I shined my flashlight, I saw nothing. I climbed into my tent that night, hoping to get some sleep. The wind had picked up a little, but the sounds outside had stopped. At least I thought they had. Then, around 2 a.m., I woke up. Not from a noise, but from a feeling. I could hear the faintest sound, almost like something brushing against the side of my tent. Slow, methodical. My breath caught in my chest, and I froze, not daring to move. I reached for my camera. I didn't want to make any noise, but I had to record. Maybe it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But as I rolled the camera, the feeling in my gut told me it wasn't just a curious animal. I whispered into the camera, barely audible, It's right outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, my eyes fixed on the shadows outside, waiting for the sound to stop. Didn't. By the time the sun rose, the air had changed. Everything felt wrong. I packed up my gear quickly, still shaking from the night's events. I checked my camera. The last recording was just me whispering, "It's right outside." The footage was shaky, my hand unsteady as I pointed the camera toward the entrance of my tent. But the next morning, when I made my way back to the main trailhead, I was struck by the emptiness. The eerie stillness of the forest was gone, replaced by something almost peaceful. Almost too peaceful. I found the trailhead, and when I reached the ranger station, I felt a sense of relief. I was almost back. Just a few more steps. Just another hour to the parking lot, and I could head home. I went back to the ranger station the next day to check out. I was greeted by a ranger who didn't look surprised to see me at first. He asked how my trip had gone, but as I reached for my car keys, I noticed something odd. His expression shifted. His eyes dropped to something on the counter, something I hadn't seen before. A camera. It wasn't mine at first, but when he turned it around and I saw the logo, my stomach dropped. That was my camera. "I found this near the trailhead," the ranger said, handing it to me. It was left behind. I immediately checked the footage. There on the screen was the last recording. The whisper, "It's right outside." But as I replayed it, I felt a strange sense of dread crawl up my spine. The camera had been found intact. My tent set up perfectly. Everything was as I left it, except for one thing. I wasn't in the footage anymore. The ranger handed the camera back to me. His expression had changed. He looked concerned, almost disturbed. "You're the only one left from that trip, aren't you?" he asked. I nodded, confused. "Yes, I'm the only one." "Then where's your partner?" he asked, glancing around as if checking for someone else. I couldn't speak for a moment. I stared at him, the weight of the question hitting me harder than I could have expected. "What do you mean?" I said. "It's just me." The ranger went silent. He pointed to the camera screen. "We've been searching for you. Your name was flagged in the system." I don't remember much after that. I don't remember how I got to the car, or what happened in the days that followed. But when I went back through the footage later, I realized something disturbing. The last shot, the one I took right before packing up, was still there. I was standing outside the tent, the camera pointed toward the trees. The sun was rising in the distance, but in the reflection of the lens, there was something else. A figure, standing just behind me. I never saw it, not once during the entire trip, but the camera caught it. It was there, and when I checked the footage, I realized that it was staring directly at the lens, at me, like it knew I was filming. Like it knew I could never see it.